Have you ever noticed how the loudest decisions about your life are often made in the quietest rooms? How the people who claim to love you most can discuss your future, as if you are a piece of furniture to be moved, a delicate problem to be solved and stored away. I learned this on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been filled with the scent of roasting chicken and the gentle murmur of a contented life. Instead, the air in my living room grew thin and cold, each word spoken by my daughter, Chloe, and her husband, Marcus, sucking the warmth from the space Richard and I had so lovingly built. It was 6 months since Richard's passing, a chasm of time that felt both like a single, agonizing moment and an eternity of hollow days. They had come over for lunch, a new, slightly forced tradition meant to ensure I was coping. Their concern was a cloak they wore, and until that day, I had never thought to look underneath. Marcus began, his voice smooth and reasonable, the tone he used for business negotiations. "Eleanor, we've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, placing a glossy brochure on the polished surface of the coffee table. The title gleamed under the lamplight. Oakwood Meadows, a premier lifestyle community. I stared at the picture of a smiling, silver-haired couple playing shuffleboard. It was a place where life went to gracefully end. "This house," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the walls that held 60 years of my life, "it's a lot to manage. The upkeep, the taxes. Chloe and I worry." Chloe, my daughter, my only child, reached across and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was cool. "It's for your own good, Mum. We found a lovely one-bedroom apartment there. It has a kitchenette, and all your meals are provided. There are activities. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." I looked at her face, searching for the little girl who used to bring me fistfuls of dandelions, whose scraped knees I had kissed better. I saw only a polite, determined stranger. I said nothing. My silence has always been misinterpreted as agreement, as passivity. It is a language I have been fluent in for decades. A quiet retreat when the world becomes too loud. In that moment, it was a shield. "We've even spoken to a realtor," Chloe added, her voice bright with accomplishment. "The market is incredible right now. Selling this place would set you up for the rest of your life, completely secure. You wouldn't have to touch your savings." They had planned it all. The sale of my home, the repository of my memories. The disposition of my life, neatly packaged and filed away in a one-bedroom unit with a panic button by the bed. They spoke of my savings, the modest portfolio Richard and I had carefully nurtured. They knew nothing of the other thing. The real thing. The mansion. Richard had called it his folly, a sprawling stone house on 100 acres of untouched woodland, 2 hours north. It was a project he had worked on for the last decade of his life, a place he went to think. He'd left it to me, and me alone, in a separate will they knew nothing about. It was my secret, my inheritance, my final gift from the man who had truly known the substance of my silence. As I looked at the brochure, at their expectant, smiling faces, a cold, hard clarity began to form in my heart. This wasn't about concern. This was about convenience. I was a loose end, and they were neatly tying me up. And as I sat there, a ghost in my own living room, I was so profoundly, terribly grateful that I had never told them about the mansion. It was a secret that was about to become my salvation. The quiet in the house after they left was different. It wasn't the peaceful, settled silence of a home at rest, it was the charged, humming silence of a vacuum. The space they had occupied still seemed to hold the chill of their intentions. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the frames of photographs, the worn spines of Richard's books. Everything felt fragile, as if their words had been a tremor that had shaken the very foundations of my life, revealing cracks I had never noticed before. My reflection in the darkened dining room window showed a woman I barely recognized, a little stooped, her face a map of grief. But it was the look in her eyes that startled me. It wasn't just sadness. It was the dawning of a terrible understanding. I replayed their conversation, but this time, I listened with new ears. Marcus's casual mention of liquidating assets, Chloe's gentle insistence on simplifying my life. They were such clean, sterile words for such a brutal act of erasure. They wanted to dismantle my world, piece by piece, and call it love. And as I stood there, the full weight of their betrayal settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, sickening thud. This wasn't a new idea for them. It was a plan that had been growing in the dark, nurtured by their own ambitions and a profound underestimation of me. I began to remember other things, small moments that were insignificant on their own, but now formed a damning constellation. The time Chloe had referred to my garden, my pride and joy, as too much work for you now, Mum. The way Marcus's eyes had scanned the living room, not with warmth, but with the cool appraisal of an auctioneer. The condescending patience in their voices when I struggled with a new app on my phone. They had been subtly, methodically redefining me in their own minds, from mother and matriarch to burden and responsibility. They saw my grief not as a process to be respected, but as a weakness to be managed. An opportunity. I made myself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in a sea of turmoil. I sat at the kitchen table, the one where Chloe had once done her homework, where Richard and I had made countless decisions, big and small. I had always believed this table, this house, would be the heart of our family, passed down through generations. Now I saw it for what it was to them, real estate. A commodity. The bitter taste of the tea matched the bitterness in my soul. I had spent so much of my life accommodating others, smoothing over rough edges, keeping the peace. It was my role, the one I had accepted without question. The quiet, supportive wife. The ever-present, self-sacrificing mother. I had allowed myself to become the backdrop to everyone else's life, and now that the main actor, my Richard, had left the stage, they were ready to strike the set. But as the evening deepened and the house grew dark around me, something else began to stir beneath the grief and the shock. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time, a slow, burning ember of anger. Not a fiery, destructive rage, but a cold, steady, illuminating fire. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness. They had mistaken my grief for incompetence. They had made a grave and profound miscalculation. I was not a problem to be solved. I was not a balance sheet to be liquidated. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was still the mistress of this house and the captain of my own soul. The brochure for Oakwood Meadows was still on the coffee table. I walked over, picked it up, and without ceremony, tore it in half, then in half again. The sound of the ripping paper was the only noise in the heavy silence, a small, defiant act of war. It was the first shot fired in a battle they didn't even know we were fighting. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself drawn to Richard's study, a room I had mostly avoided since his death. It felt too much like him, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains. But tonight, it wasn't a place of sorrow, it was a sanctuary. I ran my fingers along the spines of his history books, his biographies, his collections of poetry. He had been a man of substance, a man who understood that a life's true value wasn't in its liquidity, but in its legacy. It was that thought that led me to the old mahogany filing cabinet in the corner. It was locked, as it always had been. Richard had a system for everything, a place for every important document. Our shared life, the deed to our home, our joint will, our insurance policies, was in the safe downstairs. But this cabinet was his alone. He had once patted it and said, with a twinkle in his eye, "This, Ellie, is my contingency plan." I never asked what he meant. I trusted him implicitly. Now, I needed to know. The key, he had told me once in passing, was in the one place no one would ever think to look. It took me an hour of searching, my mind sifting through years of conversations, looking for the clue. And then it came to me. His favorite book, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations tucked inside the back cover, taped neatly to the cardboard, was a small, ornate brass key. My hand trembled as I unlocked the cabinet. The drawer slid open with a quiet sigh, revealing a single, thick, leather-bound portfolio. My name, Eleanor Vance, was embossed in gold on the cover. I lifted it out and carried it to his desk, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Inside, everything was perfectly organized. There was a deed, clear and unambiguous, for a property I had only seen a handful of times, 100 acres, stone house, and all appurtenances, in the county of Northwood. And below it, the owner's name, Eleanor Vance. Not Eleanor and Richard Vance. Just me. Beneath the deed was a separate last will and testament, notarized and dated just 1 year prior. It pertained only to this property and its contents, and it was devastatingly simple. Everything was left to me, his beloved wife, with the explicit instruction that it was to remain outside of our shared family trust, to be disposed of, or not, entirely at my discretion. And then, at the very bottom, there was a letter. A thick, cream-colored envelope with my name written in Richard's familiar, elegant script. With unsteady fingers, I opened it. The letter began, "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are facing the world alone. I know your strength, but I also know your gentle heart, and how it can be bent by the will of others who believe they know what is best for you." Each word was a balm, a voice from the past speaking directly to my present pain. He saw me. He had always seen me. I bought the house in Northwood for you, Ellie. It was never a folly. It was my promise. A promise that you would always have a place that was yours and yours alone. A fortress of solitude and peace, beyond the reach of anyone's expectations or demands. Our children, whom we love, have their own lives and their own way of seeing the world, a way that is sometimes more practical than it is kind. I fear they might see your grief as an opportunity to manage you, to simplify your life into something that fits their own. Do not let them. Your life is not a footnote to theirs. It is a story that is still being written. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the ink. They were not tears of grief, but of profound, overwhelming love and gratitude. He had known. He had anticipated this very moment, this very feeling of being erased, and he had built me an ark. He went on to describe the property in detail, the well, the generator, the high-speed internet connection he'd had installed. He wrote of the library he had filled with books he knew I would love, the professional-grade kitchen, the gardens he had planned but never had the chance to plant. He ended the letter with a final, powerful instruction. This is your fortress, Ellie. Use it to defend your peace. Or use it as a launching point for a new adventure. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Do not let anyone rush your decisions. Your silence is not emptiness, it is a well of strength. Draw from it. I love you, always. Richard. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. The cold fear that had gripped me since Sunday afternoon began to recede, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. Richard had not just left me a house, he had left me a blueprint for survival. He had given me a weapon, and he had reminded me how to use it. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, hopeful light into the study. I was no longer a grieving widow waiting to be put out to pasture. I was the keeper of a promise, the owner of a fortress. And the war for my own life had just truly begun. The first call I made was not to a lawyer or a banker, but to Margaret. Margaret Atherton. We had worked together for 20 years at the City Archives before she'd made a late-in-life career change and gone to law school, eventually becoming a fiercely intelligent estate lawyer. We had a friendship forged in the quiet, dusty aisles of history, built on a shared love for facts, for primary sources, for the undeniable truth of the written word. Now retired, her mind was as sharp as the day she'd passed the bar. When she answered the phone, her voice was exactly as I remembered, crisp, warm, and with no tolerance for nonsense. Eleanor. What a pleasant surprise. I was just wrestling with a particularly stubborn crossword puzzle. To what do I owe the honor? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Margaret, I need your help. I need the lawyer, not just the friend. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the subtle shift in her attention. The crossword was forgotten. Of course, Eleanor. What's wrong? You sound different. I'm calling from Richard's study, I said, my voice steady. And I'm holding what he called his contingency plan. I explained everything. The Sunday lunch. The brochure for Oakwood Meadows. The cold, calculated way Chloe and Marcus had laid out the plan for the rest of my life. I told her about their assumptions, their gentle condescension, their complete and utter dismissal of me as a person with agency. As I spoke, I felt no self-pity, only a growing sense of clarity, as if I were presenting a case file. Then, I told her about the locked cabinet, the key, and the contents of the leather portfolio. I described the deed to the Northwood property and the separate will. Margaret listened without interruption, a skill she had perfected in her years as a lawyer. I could almost see her in my mind's eye, sitting in her sunlit study, a pen in her hand, making neat, precise notes. When I finished, the silence on the line was not empty, but full of thought. That clever, wonderful man, she said, her voice soft with admiration for Richard. Then, it hardened. And your daughter and her husband. Eleanor, this is more common than you think. It's a form of elder abuse, wrapped in the language of concern. They see an asset, not a home. They see a dependent, not a mother. Hearing her say it, so plainly and without accusation, was a profound validation. It swept away the last vestiges of my own self-doubt. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't misinterpreting their intentions. I was seeing the truth, and the truth was ugly. They have underestimated you, Eleanor, Margaret continued, her voice now all business. They've done it for your entire life, I imagine. They've mistaken your quiet nature for a lack of will. We are going to use that. We are going to build a wall around you so high, and so strong they won't even know which brick to push against. Hope, real and tangible, began to bloom in my chest. What do? I asked. First, she said, you do nothing. You do not call them. You do not confront them. You let them believe their plan is proceeding. Let them call the realtor. Let them get their hopes up. Their arrogance will be their undoing. Second, you and I are going to meet. Tomorrow. Bring the portfolio and every other financial document you have, bank statements, investment records, the deed to your current home, your shared will. Everything. We are going to conduct a full financial and legal audit of Eleanor Vance. And then, we are going to create a new entity, the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust, with you as the sole trustee. The words sounded so powerful, so official. The Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust. It was the opposite of Oakwood Meadows. It was a declaration of permanence, of control. Can I do that? I asked, a tremor of my old uncertainty creeping in. My dear woman, Margaret said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. You can do whatever the hell you want. Richard made sure of it. This isn't about the mansion, Eleanor. Not really. The mansion is your ace in the hole, your secret weapon. This is about your home, your savings, your life. This is about ensuring that the only person who gets to write the next chapter of your story is you. We set a time to meet the next day. As I hung up the phone, the house no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt like a headquarters. The fear and confusion had been replaced by a clear, cold sense of purpose. Margaret had given me more than legal advice. She had given me a strategy. She had reminded me that I was not just a character in someone else's play. I was the author. And the next chapter was going to be a masterpiece of my own design. The next morning, I laid everything out on Margaret's vast oak dining table. The documents formed a mosaic of my life with Richard, the thick, folded deed to our family home, statements from savings accounts opened decades ago, stock certificates, the carefully drafted will we had signed together. And beside them all, like a visiting royal, sat Richard's leather portfolio, containing the secret of Northwood. Margaret, dressed in a sharp blazer despite being retired, poured us both a cup of strong, black coffee. She put on a pair of reading glasses and began to work, her focus absolute. For hours, she sifted through the papers, her pen making quiet, scratching sounds on a yellow legal pad. She was a master of her craft, translating the dense jargon of finance and law into a clear, concise narrative of my life. "All right," she said finally, leaning back in her chair and taking off her glasses. "Here's where you stand." She explained it to me not as a grieving widow, but as a client. She outlined my assets, my liabilities, my net worth. She showed me how the shared will was structured, and how, upon Richard's death, control of many of our joint assets had become ambiguous, creating the very loophole of vulnerability that Chloe and Marcus were attempting to exploit. "They are not wrong about one thing," Margaret said, tapping the shared will. "If you were to become incapacitated, as co-executors, they would have significant power to make financial decisions on your behalf. Their strategy, I imagine, is to gently nudge you toward a state of learned helplessness until you just hand them that power. Moving you to a managed facility is the first, and most critical, step in that process." The cold, clinical way she described it sent a shiver down my spine. It was exactly what was happening. "But," she continued, picking up the separate will from the Northwood portfolio, "this changes everything. Richard was brilliant. By creating this separate, significant asset and leaving it solely to you, outside the family trust, he established a powerful precedent of your individual financial standing. He legally separated a part of your identity from his." She then laid out the plan, a series of strategic moves that felt like a quiet, elegant chess game. "First, we would establish the new trust, the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust." The name alone felt like a suit of armor. "Into this trust, we would move the deed to my current home. This single act would take the house off the table, permanently. It could not be sold without the consent of the trust, and I was the only trustee. Next, we would consolidate my personal savings and investments, moving them from joint accounts into new accounts held solely by the trust. We are not hiding the money," she explained. "We are protecting it. We are building a legal fortress, just as Richard intended. When Chloe and Marcus come to you with the papers from the realtor and the paperwork for Oakwood Meadows, you will be able to tell them, quite truthfully, that the matter is out of your hands. You will simply say that your assets are now managed by a trust, and the trust's directives do not allow for the sale of the property." The sheer, beautiful simplicity of it was breathtaking. It required no shouting, no emotional confrontation, no dredging up of grievances. It was a quiet, factual, and legally unassailable checkmate. It was a strategy built on the very things they underestimated in me: silence, deliberation, and precision. "And what about Northwood?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Margaret smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "Northwood," she said, "is your reward. It's your secret garden. You don't have to tell them about it, ever. It is your private place, your source of strength. The power of Northwood is not in its monetary value, but in the fact that they have no idea it exists. It is the foundation of your independence." We spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with her contacts. A briskly efficient banker, a young, sharp lawyer who specialized in trusts. With Margaret vouching for me, things moved with incredible speed. Appointments were made. Paperwork was prepared. By the time I left her house, the sun was setting, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in months. I was no longer just defending my past, I was actively building my future. The plan was in motion. The pieces were moving on the board. And I, the quiet queen who they thought was trapped in the corner, was about to make a move that would change the entire game. Before I executed the final parts of Margaret's plan, I knew there was something I had to do first. I had to see it. I had to stand in the space that Richard had built for me, to understand the gift not as a legal document, but as a reality. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I packed a small overnight bag, a thermos of coffee, and the keys that had been in Richard's portfolio. I left a short, vague message on Chloe's voicemail, saying I was taking a day or two to visit an old friend. A small, necessary deception. The drive north was a journey through my own memories. The city gave way to suburbs, then to rolling farmland, and finally to the dense, quiet forests of the north. The further I drove, the lighter I felt, as if I were shedding the weight of the last 6 months with every mile. The air grew cleaner, the sky wider. I was driving toward my future. I followed Richard's handwritten directions, which were as precise and thoughtful as he was. The final turn was onto an unmarked gravel road that wound its way through a cathedral of old-growth pines. And then, the trees parted, and I saw it. The word mansion was both right and wrong. It wasn't a gaudy palace of new money. It was a house made of time itself. Built from massive, locally quarried stones, with a slate roof and large, generous windows, it looked as though it had grown out of the landscape. It was strong, serene, and beautiful. It was, I realized with a sudden intake of breath, a perfect reflection of the man who had built it. The key turned smoothly in the heavy oak door. I stepped inside, and the scent of cedar, stone, and clean, still air enveloped me. The house was not empty, it was waiting. Sunlight streamed through a 2-story window in the great room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny fairies. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth clean and ready. The furniture was simple, elegant, and comfortable: leather armchairs, solid wood tables, woven rugs. It was furnished not for show, but for living. I walked from room to room, my hand trailing along the cool plaster walls. The kitchen was a dream, with professional-grade appliances, and a huge butcher-block island. Richard knew how much I loved to cook, how I found peace in the rhythm of chopping and stirring. He had built me a culinary sanctuary. Upstairs, I found the library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with thousands of books. My gaze scanned the titles: poetry, history, art, fiction. He had curated a library of my heart, gathering all my favorite authors and adding hundreds of others he knew I would want to discover. In the center of the room was a large, comfortable reading chair, positioned perfectly in the light of a window that looked out over the endless forest. This was more than a house. It was a love letter written in stone and wood. It was a testament to a man who had paid attention, who had seen me and known me completely. He knew my quiet passions, my unspoken desires, and he had given them a physical form. I found the master bedroom at the end of the hall. It was a simple, peaceful room with a large bed and a private balcony that overlooked a clearing where a family of deer grazed, unbothered by my arrival. On the bedside table was a small, framed photograph of the two of us, taken on our 40th anniversary. We were laughing, our heads close together. Seeing it there, in this place, felt like he was in the room with me. I spent the rest of the day exploring. I found the walking trails he had carved through the woods, the small pond with a wooden bench beside it, the clearing he had designated for a future garden. Every detail was an act of love, an act of foresight. This was not a contingency plan, it was a continuation. As dusk fell, I built a fire in the great room fireplace. I sat in one of the leather armchairs, the warmth chasing away the last of the chill in my bones. For the first time since Richard died, I didn't feel like a widow. I didn't feel like a problem to be managed. I felt like myself. Eleanor. In the quiet solitude of that magnificent house, I finally understood. Richard hadn't just given me a place to hide. He had given me a place to become. The fortress was not meant to keep the world out, It was meant to give me the strength to face it on my own terms. And I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul, that I would not fail him. Returning to my familiar home, after 2 days at Northwood, was like stepping back into a life that no longer fit. The house felt smaller, the air thicker with unspoken things. But I was different. The quiet strength I had found in the stone house by the forest had come back with me. It was an invisible shield, a core of resolve that no amount of patronizing concern could penetrate. I was now ready to execute the rest of Margaret's plan. The following week was a series of quiet, decisive actions. There were no dramatic confrontations, only the calm, methodical signing of papers. I met with the trust lawyer, a young woman named Miss Davis, whose sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing. She walked me through the documents for the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust. Reading the legal language, I felt a thrill of power. The trust was its own entity, a legal person whose sole purpose was to protect my interests, as directed by me, the sole trustee. Signing my name at the bottom of the document felt like a revolutionary act. With a few strokes of a pen, I had built the first wall of my fortress. The next step was the transfer of assets. I visited my bank, the same branch I had used for 40 years. The manager, Mr. Henderson, had known both me and Richard. When I explained that I was consolidating my accounts under a new trust, he was a model of professional discretion, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, respect. He saw not a confused old woman, but a woman taking control of her affairs. One by one, I closed the old joint accounts and moved the funds into new accounts held in the name of the trust. It was a quiet, paper-based battle, fought with deposit slips and transfer orders. The final and most significant act was transferring the deed of my home into the trust. This was the masterstroke, the move that would render Chloe and Marcus's entire plan moot. When I signed the transfer document at the lawyer's office, I felt the house settle around me, more securely mine than ever before. During this time, I began a secret project. I started packing. But I was not packing for a move to Oakwood Meadows. In the evenings, I would go through my belongings, not as someone liquidating a life, but as a curator selecting the most precious artifacts. I packed Richard's favorite books from the study, the ones that were not already waiting for me in Northwood. I carefully wrapped the porcelain teacups my grandmother had brought from England. I took down my favorite paintings, the small, intimate landscapes I had collected over the years. These were not items to be sold off by a realtor, they were pieces of my soul. I bought sturdy, archival quality boxes, and I labeled them not with generic terms like kitchen or living room, but with purpose. Northwood Library, Northwood Kitchen, Balcony Garden. Each box was a promise to myself. Each packed object was a vote of confidence in my new future. Chloe called several times that week, her voice a little tight with impatience. Just checking in, Mum. Have you had a chance to look over that brochure? I've glanced at it, dear, I would say, my voice calm and noncommittal. Did the realtor call you? She pressed. Yes, a lovely woman. She's sending over some paperwork. I let her believe it was all proceeding according to her plan. I gave her nothing to push against. My quietness, once a sign of compliance, was now my greatest strategic tool. They were so confident in their assessment of me that they couldn't imagine any other possibility. They heard my placid tones and assumed I was resigned, defeated. They had no idea that I was, in fact, assembling an army, right under their noses. By the end of the week, the legal work was done. The fortress was built. My secret cache of treasured belongings was stored neatly in the spare room, ready for a different kind of moving day. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had taken their plan, a plan designed to erase me, and I had used its energy to forge a new destiny for myself. I was ready. Let them come with their papers and their false concern. I was no longer the woman they thought they knew. I was the trustee of my own life, and the meeting was about to be called to order. They arrived the following Sunday, exactly 2 weeks after their initial ambush. They came armed with a leather briefcase and an air of triumphant finality. Chloe carried a bouquet of lilies, funereal flowers that she probably thought were cheerful. Marcus had the sleek, confident smile of a man about to close a deal. They found me in the living room, reading by the window, a cup of tea on the table beside me. I had set the stage for this quiet confrontation with deliberate care. The room was tidy, filled with afternoon light. I was dressed in a simple but elegant silk blouse. I was the picture of calm. "Mum," Chloe said, her voice bright and overly solicitous, as she placed the flowers in a vase. "We have such good news." Marcus opened his briefcase on the coffee table, the same table where they had placed the Oakwood Meadows brochure. This time, he laid out a sheaf of official-looking documents. "We've got the ball rolling," he announced, tapping a professionally printed folder. "The realtor, Brenda, is fantastic. She's already done a preliminary valuation, and it's even better than we hoped. The market is red hot. All you need to do is sign the listing agreement." He pushed the folder toward me. Next to it, he placed another folder. "And this is the application for your apartment at Oakwood. We've put down a deposit to hold the corner unit with the garden view. But we need your signature on the final lease agreement by the end of the week." They both looked at me, their faces radiating smug satisfaction. They had done it. They had solved the problem of mother. They had managed my life into neat, manageable little boxes. I didn't look at the papers. I looked at my daughter, at her husband. I let the silence stretch, a tactic I had learned from Margaret. I let them sit in their own anticipation. Finally, when the quiet became uncomfortable for them, I spoke. My voice was soft, but it carried the weight of all the decisions I had made. "That won't be necessary," Chloe blinked. "What do you mean, Mum?" "Brenda needs the listing agreement to get started." "There will be no listing agreement," I said calmly. I looked at Marcus. "And you can cancel the application for the apartment. Please make sure you get your deposit back." Their smiles faltered. A look of confusion passed between them. This was not on their script. "Mum, what are you talking about?" Chloe asked, a note of irritation creeping into her voice. "We've gone to a lot of trouble to arrange all this for you." "I know you have," I said, my tone even, betraying no anger. "But it was based on a misunderstanding. You see, the house is not for sale." Marcus let out a short, impatient laugh. "Eleanor, we've been over this. It's too much for you. It's not practical to stay here." "That is no longer your concern," I said, still quiet, still calm. "As of last Tuesday, this property, along with my other primary assets, was placed into a private, irrevocable trust." This was the moment. The delivery of the fact that would dismantle their entire worldview. Marcus stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "A trust? What trust? Who's the trustee?" "I am," I said simply. I folded my hands in my lap. "The Eleanor Vance Trust. My solicitor and financial advisor recommended it as the most prudent way to manage my estate. The directives of the trust, which I established, do not permit the liquidation of this property. It is to be maintained as my primary residence. The matter, as I said, is out of my hands." Chloe looked from me to Marcus, completely bewildered. "A solicitor? When did you get a solicitor?" "I've had one for some time," I said, which was not a lie. "Margaret and I had been friends for 40 years. They were stunned into silence. They were looking at me, but they were not seeing the frail, grieving woman they had planned to install in a retirement community. They were seeing a stranger. A woman of means and agency, who had moved decisively and silently against them. They had no argument. There was no one to yell at, no emotional outburst to pathologize. I had presented them with a legal and financial fact. It was a wall, just as Margaret had described, smooth and high and with no visible handholds. So, you're just going to stay here? Chloe finally stammered. Alone? I won't be alone, I said. I have my books, my garden, and my memories. And I have my independence. Which, I have discovered, is very good company. I stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. Thank you for the lilies, I said. It was thoughtful of you to come. They left in a state of quiet shock, the leather briefcase full of their useless papers. I watched from the window as they walked to their car, not speaking to each other, their confident strides gone. They hadn't just lost a deal. They had lost control. And I, in the quiet of my home, now truly my own, had never felt so powerfully, peacefully, in control of my own life. The secret of Northwood remained mine alone, a silent, potent source of the strength they could never comprehend. In the months that followed, a new kind of quiet settled into my life. The absence of Chloe and Marcus's strained, purposeful visits was a relief. Our relationship had shifted into a formal, distant politeness. They called on holidays, their conversations brief and superficial. They never mentioned the trust again. They couldn't fight a battle they didn't understand against an opponent they had never really known. I could have simply lived in my victory, shuttling between my protected home and the secret sanctuary of Northwood. I could have spent my days reading in the great library, and my evenings by the stone fireplace, content in my solitude. And for a while, I did. I let the peace of Northwood seep into my bones, healing the bruises of the past year. But Richard's letter echoed in my mind, use it to defend your peace. Or use it as a launching point for a new adventure. The house was not just a fortress, it was a promise. It was too much of a gift, too full of life and potential, to be kept for me alone. Its purpose, I began to realize, was larger than my own comfort. The idea came to me one afternoon, as I was sitting on the wooden bench by the pond. I was watching a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis on a milkweed leaf. It was a slow, difficult struggle, but the creature that finally emerged was vibrant and strong, ready for a new life. I thought about my own transformation, from the quiet, accommodating widow to the resolute trustee of my own fate. I thought about how many other women there must be, women of my generation, who had spent their lives as wives, mothers, and caretakers, only to find themselves in their later years feeling invisible, underestimated, or erased. Women who had quiet passions and unspoken dreams that had been set aside for the needs of others. That was the moment the true legacy of Northwood was born. It would not just be my home. It would be a haven. I envisioned a place where women over 60 could come for a time, to rest, to reflect, and to rediscover the person they were before they became everything to everyone else. It would be a place to write the book they never wrote, paint the canvas they never touched, or simply sit in the silence and decide what their next chapter would be. I called it the Hearthstone Retreat. The name came to me instantly. The hearth is the heart of a home, a source of warmth and community. And stone represents the strength and endurance I wanted these women to find in themselves. I threw myself into the project with a vigor I hadn't felt in years. My mind, which Chloe and Marcus had assumed was softening, felt sharper than ever. I met with architects to design 2 small, beautiful cabins to be built discreetly in the woods. I worked with a landscape designer to finally plant the gardens Richard had dreamed of, focusing on native plants and creating meditative walking paths. I hired a small staff, a chef who specialized in farm-to-table cuisine, a local property manager, and a program director. My most important hire was Ms. Davis, the sharp young lawyer who had drafted my trust. I brought her on as the foundation's legal counsel, and she became an invaluable and enthusiastic partner in the venture. We established the Hearthstone Retreat as a non-profit foundation, funded initially by a portion of the investments Richard and I had made over the years. The mansion itself, the House of Stone, would serve as the central gathering place, the library, the dining hall, the great room for conversation and quiet contemplation. My personal residence would be one of the new, smaller cabins, allowing me to be present, but also to maintain my own space. The work was consuming and joyful. I was no longer just managing my own life, I was building a legacy. I was transforming a personal act of self-preservation into a communal act of empowerment. I was taking Richard's final gift of love and multiplying it, sending its ripples out into the world. I never told Chloe and Marcus about it. I saw no need. My new life was not a performance for their benefit, or a rebuke to their actions. It was simply my life, full and purposeful, lived entirely on my own terms. The quiet power I had found in defending my home had blossomed into the vibrant, active power of creating a new one, not just for me, but for many others to come. A year after the quiet confrontation in my living room, on a crisp autumn afternoon, the Hearthstone retreat officially opened. The 2 new cabins, built of cedar and glass, were nestled so perfectly into the woods they seemed to have always been there. The gardens were thriving, a riot of late-season color. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke from the great room's fireplace and the aroma of roasted butternut squash from the kitchen. Our first 2 residents had arrived that morning. One was a retired teacher from Chicago, who had always dreamed of writing a memoir. The other was a former nurse from a small town in Ohio, who wanted to learn landscape painting. They were women like me, with stories in their eyes and a flicker of apprehension mixed with hope. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the grieving widow. I was Eleanor Vance, the founder. I watched from the window of my own small cabin, as the 2 women sat, with our program director in the great room, cups of tea in their hands, their initial nervousness giving way to quiet conversation. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't a number on a bank statement, or the square footage of a house. It was this. It was purpose. It was creation. It was the quiet, immense satisfaction of taking something meant for one and turning it into a gift for many. Later that evening, the 4 of us ate dinner together at the long wooden table in the dining hall. We talked about books, and art, and the changing colors of the leaves outside. We shared stories from our pasts, not as laments, but as the foundations upon which we were now building. There was laughter, easy and genuine. I looked at the faces of these women, strangers just that morning, and felt a kinship deeper than the strained connection I now had with my own daughter. We were a new kind of family, one forged not by blood, but by a shared desire to write our own endings. I wonder if you've ever reached a point in your life where you had to choose between the person you have been and the person you still could be. It's a quiet crossroads, and often, there's no one there to direct you. You have to find the map within yourself. My map was a letter from a man who loved me enough to see my future, even when he wouldn't be in it. He gave me a fortress, and I learned that the strongest fortresses are not the ones that keep people out, but the ones that give you the strength to welcome the right people in. My daughter and her husband still believe I am living a small, quiet life in the house I refuse to sell. They have no idea that I am living the largest, most vibrant life I have ever known. They see my silence and mistake it for emptiness. They don't understand that my silence is full. It is full of the rustle of leaves on the walking path, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the quiet scratching of a pen on paper, as a woman finally tells her own story. It is the sound of a legacy being built, one stone, one book, one peaceful day at a time. I have found my peace, not in what I kept secret, but in what I chose to create. And it is a peace more valuable than any mansion.